Some of the most fundamental assumptions we've had about our political system, about liberal democracy, have turned out in the last decades to be mistaken. The most extreme and often caricatured form of that assumption was expressed by Francis Fukuyama in his idea of the end of history. But even though a lot of people, in some ways unjustly, sneered at his work, the underlying thought was one that was actually a matter of wide consensus among citizens, journalists, political scientists around the world. We all recognized that there was some poor countries that were trying to be democracies, that were struggling to establish that political system. We all knew that it wasn't obvious that every autocratic system in the world would transition to democracy, but we all also assumed that there was a certain set of affluent countries with deep, long democratic histories in which we could take the future somewhat for granted. In the terms of one famous political science paper from the 1990s, once you'd had a couple of changeovers through governments, through free and fair elections, once GDP per capita had reached about $14,000 in today's terms, democracy was safe. There wasn't a single example in history of a democracy in a country like that collapsing. And the way that this manifested supposedly was through a process of democratic consolidation, which was thought of as a one-way street, and through which democracy became, quote-unquote, the only game in town. We would get to a stage, and in countries like the United Kingdom, like the United States, like Germany, where I grew up, like Sweden and Italy, we had gotten to the stage, supposedly, where nearly everybody agreed on the importance of democracy. A huge majority of citizens rejected authoritarian alternatives to democracy, and there weren't any powerful political parties and forces that actually challenged the most basic rules and norms of that political system. Before Donald Trump was elected and before this country voted to exit the European Union, some of those things were starting to change. In the United States, over 2/3 of older Americans born in the 1930s and 1940s said that it was absolutely essential to them to live in a democracy. Among younger Americans born since 1980, less than 1/3 did. People became much more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that army rule was a good system of government. Now it's 1 in 6. Among young and affluent Americans, it's actually gone up from 6 to 35% over the course of 20 years. And this is not just a story about Americans being a little strange on the other side of the pond. It's a similar story in various European countries as well. In Germany, 16% said that a strong ruler who doesn't have to bother with parliament elections was a good system of government 20 years ago. Now it's 33%. In France and the United Kingdom, it's doubled from 25 to 50% of people who say a strong ruler who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections is a good idea. Now, it's a little difficult to interpret all of those data points. It's not clear whether people who say this sort of thing in polls actually mean it. But we also see a real transformation in the voting behavior of ordinary citizens. We see that the average vote share of populist parties in Europe was 8% in 2000 and is over 25% now. Winston Churchill famously spoke of an iron curtain descending from Stettin in the north of Europe to Trieste in the south. Well, now you can start in Stettin in the Baltic Sea and drive far further south than Trieste to Athens in the Aegean and never leave the populist belt, never leave a country ruled by a populist. And so I think to make sense of what is going on, we have to understand that there's two basic elements to our political systems. We live in liberal democracies, which means that we live in political systems that promise both to give people some modicum of individual liberty, where we get to determine ourselves how to lead our lives, what to say, not to say, whether to worship and to whom, what kind of relationship to start. And the second value, collective self-rule, that there isn't somebody who's born to rule over us, there isn't a dictator who cannot be displaced. We collectively determine what happens in our politics. These two elements of our political system are starting to fall apart, but it's getting more and more difficult to fulfill both of those things at the same time. For a long time, I show, not just in Britain, not just in various European countries, but also in the United States, also in Canada and other places, we have seen the rise of what I would call a form of undemocratic liberalism, or rights without democracy, in which we do a reasonably good job at protecting the rule of law and the separation of powers and respecting individual rights, But our political system is not responsive enough to what people actually want. We're not actually translating popular views into public policies. And part of that reason is the influence of money on our politics, is the degree to which legislators in many countries have become a milieu apart that doesn't have much contact with ordinary constituents. But another part of the reason is a little bit more complicated to wrap our heads around, because we are bound up with some of those institutions. And that is the way in which more and more decisions have been taken out of democratic contestation. In Europe, it sometimes takes the form of the European Union, the European Commission, but you can see in the case of the United States that it's true in countries that aren't part of the European Union as well. You have the rise of Supreme Courts that have greater and greater power of judicial review. You have the rise of central banks that aren't just more independent than they used to be, but also make more important and consequential political decisions. You have the rise of independent agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Consumer Protection Bureau or the whole set of quangos that we have in this country. You have the rise of trade treaties and international organizations. And once you take all of those things together, a lot of the most important decisions are taken by experts and technocrats who often do a good job. And the solution that the populists sometimes recommend of just getting rid of these institutions isn't always realistic. But even if we recognize some of the good things these institutions do, we also need to remember the degree to which people have a point when they say, nobody really listens to us. What we say doesn't particularly matter.